Good day, all. I'm Chaplain George Hind. I'm on the busy intersection of College and Wiggins here in Saskatoon. Thank you for inviting me to be part of Lutheran Chapel today. I work at the Lutheran Campus Center and serve on campus as a chaplain and as a member of the Faith Leaders team. The Lutheran Campus Center has been here in Saskatoon for over 40 years. Right now, the building we have houses 5 students normally, and we host a worship and a meal on Tuesdays. We gather students from the university, from all over the world, and have a time of fellowship, times of conversation, a few social events. It's my pleasure to invite you here and to also invite you, if you're ever become a student in Saskatoon, to come and join us here at the Campus Center. Today in your chapel, we'll be talking about this season that surrounds All Hallows Eve and All Saints' Day. And on All Hallows Eve, or Halloween as we know it best, the normal thing to do is arrive at someone's door and holler trick or treat. Well, we're a little early for that right now, but you're welcome inside. Well, on this Halloween, with the pandemic raging, this is the scariest Halloween costume I could think of. It's the mask of a plague doctor from the pandemics of Europe in the past. But it's kind of ironic when you think of this. It was developed in 1630 by a doctor named Charles L'Orme. And L'Orme was attempting to put together something that would keep safe those who cared for the people afflicted by the pandemic. His idea was to stuff this long beak with flowers or herbs or juniper or something that took away the strong, noxious odors that they referred to as miasma, which was part of their disease theory at the time. And by wearing this, the person could then go and visit the families and the households of those affected by the plague, give them counsel on how to keep the members of their family safe, administer to the people who were dying, and ultimately take care of the bodies which were known to worsen the plague and the transmission of disease. These were the masks of very caring civil servants who put themselves at risk in the midst of a pandemic when the wealthy were fleeing and the rest were huddling in fear. And yet somehow over time it has become the archetype of death, of fear, of disease, which is pressing all of our buttons now. And it's interesting at this Halloween season, the season of All Saints' Day, that we think about changing symbols and how those symbols have morphed over time to how we understand them now. This is nothing new in the church. The church has always adapted symbols from the cultures in which they live in and participate in. The season of Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, was part of 3 celebrations that were adopted in about 1610 or 610 by the church, a time when they celebrated the martyrs who had died in faith. And of course, those celebrations have always been part of the Christian tradition. The beginning of that, obviously, is with the burial of Jesus himself. If it hadn't been for the women who went out to conduct those final burial rites on Sunday morning, then the first witnesses of the resurrection would have been missing. In the early church, it was practice to honor those who had done exceptional ministry through burial and remembrance.
The disciples of John the Baptist had taken his body after Herod had had him beheaded and had buried him in thanksgiving for the ministry he had done in their midst. In a similar fashion, Stephen, the first martyr of the Christian church, was taken from the place where he was stoned and given a burial of remembrance. Those remembrances continued and collected so that all the saints were remembered. And the 3 days, All Hallows Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day, joined together into one celebration. The timing for it was originally in May, but about the time of Gregory III in the 1700s, this shifted to the beginning of November. Scholars now say that the shift happened because it coincided with the Celtic celebration called Samhain, which was in the British Isles. Samhain was a festival that happened at the midpoint between the beginning of fall and the start of winter. It was considered then that the spirits of the departed roamed on the land, and if they weren't happy, they could affect the crops and the livestock, which were so essential for the winter to come. And so the people of the time would set out food and drink in front of their houses, assuming that the departed souls of the people who had resided with them before returned at that point. Others held large feasts in town where it was expected that the spirits would join them in the celebration as they shared all the good food and the bounty of the harvest. They would light bonfires and place candles in gourds, both as welcome and warning for the evil spirits. And it was considered, if they celebrated well, that the harvest would be safe. Livestock would survive, and they could face the winter in confidence. The blending of these two ideas inspired the medieval Christians as well. In Germany, around the time of Martin Luther, they had a practice called souling. Now, souling may have been picked up by the early Celtic ideas where they went mumming, or a troupe of theater, people went from house to house, or guising, where people went in disguises from house to house in hopes of receiving fruit and nuts from the residents of those houses. But the Christian tradition became, in the medieval time, of souling, where children would go from house to house and pray for the souls of the people who had died in that household during the year. And in return, the wealthier houses would give them small round cakes with a hole in the middle, which were a sign of eternity, as a thanksgiving for their prayers for the departed. It's out of these early tradition of mumming, of guising, and of souling that our current tradition of trick-or-treating had its roots. So we wonder in the Christian church, how can they do that? How can they appropriate celebrations of other cultures, of other faiths? But that practice has been going on since the beginning of the New Testament itself. In Acts 17, Paul talks about traveling in Athens. And in Athens, the people there had built temples. Temples to the Greek gods, temples to the Roman gods, temples to the gods who were part of all the other peoples and cultures that the Roman army had conquered. And in the midst of all of those temples was one altar to the unknown God. And Paul noted how the Athenians prayed over and cared for that altar. And so when Paul was questioned about his faith, he pointed to it and said, "This unknown God that you have been worshiping, let me tell you who he is." And he proceeded to talk about the God who had created heaven and earth, the God in which we live and move and have our being. And the Athenians, although they strongly resisted the notion of someone rising from the dead, began to ask Paul more questions about his faith. And over time, the church in Athens became one of the pillars of the Christian church. This notion of changing or appropriated symbols from a culture is being part of our practice in the Christian tradition. In 1972, a book called The Peace Child came out. It was written by a Canadian Christian missionary who had gone to Western New Guinea to translate God's word into the language of the Sawai people. As he lived among the people and learned their complex language with all its various forms and nuances, he began to tell what was important about his faith and his understanding of God's practices among them. But the Sawai people didn't share the same particular worldview that Richardson was speaking of. When they heard the story of Jesus and his crucifixion, instead of seeing Jesus as the hero of the story, they saw him as a dupe who had been tricked into death by Judas, who they regarded as the hero of the tale. And for Richardson, this went against everything that he hoped and held and believed. And so he struggled to find an image that would take his worldview and the worldview of the Sawa people and bring them together in a meaningful way. Eventually, Richardson heard that the Sawai people, in the midst of their warlike nature, had a tradition between the various tribes. When they tired of doing battle between themselves, a prominent citizen would give up their son to live with the other tribe. And as long as that son lived, there would be peace between the tribes. And Richardson pointed out to the Sawa people, you had to trust a father who would give up his son in such a way so that there would be peace. And then he said, that's what I'm talking about when I tell you the Christian story of faith, that God gave up his son so that there would be peace between God and people. And this notion of casting the story of salvation in different terms is important for us. Christian faith does appropriate symbols. The cross itself was a symbol of torture, of brutality, of political oppression, of cruelty. And yet the cross has become, for Christian people, the symbol of life and hope found in God's promise. So it's no surprise to us that now in our modern world, appropriation can go the other way. What once was All Hallows Eve, an evening to remember those departed, those faithful martyrs, has now become an evening where we remember the terrors of the night, where we dress up in costume and live with alternate reality of fears and spookiness. But perhaps as we see that transition, we're called to ask a new question. When we do appropriate symbols, when we change symbols in our world, what do we mean by it? What do we hope to convey? What truth do we value most? As we live in this world with all of its fears, all of its pandemics, all of its celebrations of the horrors, we need to ask those same questions. What are we appropriating and why?